Imagine this. You wake up in a small, dark room. There's no window, no clock, and no one to ask how you got there. The walls are smooth, cold, almost too perfect. You pace, searching for a door, but there isn't one. Just four walls and silence. Hours pass, or days. You're not sure. Eventually, a voice comes through a hidden speaker, calm, indifferent, almost robotic. You are free to leave, once you understand why you've always chosen to stay. You laugh at first. What does that even mean? Of course you didn't choose this. Who would choose to be trapped? But as you sit, as the silence stretches thin over your thoughts, something begins to sting. Not just in your mind, but in your gut, a quiet suspicion. What if that voice wasn't wrong? What if the trap wasn't built around you, but inside you? Now zoom out. You're not in a physical room. You're living your everyday life, coffee in hand, phone buzzing, meetings, chores, obligations. But deep down, it feels the same, like something's limiting you, holding you back, like no matter how hard you push, the outcomes in your life keep slipping just out of reach. You want more control, more freedom, more power over your own story. But life keeps handing you reasons why you can't. And you accept them, like most people do, like you've been trained to do. But ask yourself this: who taught you to make peace with powerlessness? When did survival become more important than sovereignty? And more importantly, when did you start confusing comfort with freedom? That's the paradox. Most people crave safety more than truth. They'd rather call themselves victims of circumstance than admit they've outsourced their own authority. Because it's easier to blame than to build, easier to resent than to rise. But here's the twist that will haunt you. Victimhood can feel safer than leadership, because leadership demands risk, responsibility, and relentless clarity. And clarity is terrifying. Because once you see the game, you can't unsee it. Once you admit you've been playing small on purpose, you lose the excuse to keep doing it. Niccolò Machiavelli knew this centuries ago. In The Prince, he didn't write for the faint-hearted. He wrote for those willing to face the world without illusions. He spoke not of how the world should be, but how it is. Not how people ought to act, but how they do. His message wasn't cruel, it was honest. And for that, he was called dangerous. But maybe what's truly dangerous isn't the truth. It's what happens when we ignore it. Maybe the greatest threat to your potential isn't failure or fear, but the unconscious habits that make you live life as a passive observer, rather than an architect of your reality. So let's get uncomfortably honest. Do you wait for motivation instead of creating momentum? Do you justify your stagnation with stories about luck, fate, or not the right time? Do you secretly resent those who take bold action, because it reminds you of the power you haven't claimed? If so, you're not broken, you're conditioned. Conditioned to think like a subject, a servant, a cog in someone else's system. But leadership is not a title. It's not charisma, or influence, or even control over others. Leadership begins the moment you stop lying to yourself. So here's the question that matters now. The one that will set the stage for everything to come. What if you've mistaken comfort for captivity? What if your limits are just the lines you've been too afraid to cross? And what if you've had the keys this whole time, but refused to pick them up? Because freedom means you can no longer hide from your own potential. That is the question Machiavelli forces you to confront. Because the world doesn't change when the victim cries louder. It changes when the leader decides. And if you're still reading, then something inside you already knows. It's time to decide. But before you can lead, you must understand what's kept you so deeply afraid of doing it. And that takes us into the roots of the problem, not the surface symptoms but the psychological architecture that builds this inner prison. A structure crafted not by chains but by narratives, identities, inherited beliefs that have quietly kept you small. So now we go deeper, into the invisible script running beneath your life, into the mind of the victim. And the deeper, darker question, what if that voice whispering "I can't" is the only thing you've ever obeyed? There's a strange comfort in feeling powerless. It sounds wrong, even insulting, but it's true. Powerlessness gives you a pass. If life is unfair, if fate is cruel, if the system is rigged, then you don't have to take full responsibility for where you are. You can grieve, you can complain, you can wait, and best of all, you don't have to change. But that's the lie. That's the invisible sedative, that keeps most people asleep with their eyes wide open. Victimhood is not just an emotional state, it's an identity, a worldview, a lens, and once you adopt it, your brain starts to rewire around it, not because you're weak, but because your psyche is trying to protect you. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress or deny, and one of the most dangerous shadows isn't rage or greed, it's unclaimed power, because that power, when ignored, turns toxic. It doesn't disappear, it just morphs into envy, resentment, or chronic indecision. The victim tells themselves, "It's not my fault," but deep down, there's another voice, one they can't silence, whispering, "But what if it is?" That voice is not cruel, it's not shame, it's your conscience begging you to wake up. But waking up hurts. You have to admit how often you've played small. You have to acknowledge how many times you betrayed your own potential for the sake of approval, safety, or ease. And most people won't do it. Because it's easier to believe the system is broken than to accept you never tried to beat it. Let's go deeper. Why do people cling to victimhood? Because it gives them identity without effort, community without individuality, meaning without introspection. It's addictive, like sugar for the soul. It spikes your emotions, validates your pain, and tells you you don't have to change. The world does. But Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Holocaust and author of Man's Search for Meaning, said something most people today refuse to hear: everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. That is the crucifixion of the victim mindset. The idea that even in horror, even in hell, you still have a say in how you respond. That's not motivational fluff, that's existential warfare. Frankl saw men in death camps share their bread. He saw others betray their own families. The difference wasn't circumstance, it was character. Or more precisely, consciousness. Jean-Paul Sartre said, "We are condemned to be free." That freedom is not a gift, but a burden. Because once you accept that you are free, you can no longer hide behind excuses. You are exposed, naked, seen. Every failure, every stagnation, every missed opportunity is now on you. That's why people unconsciously avoid freedom. It's terrifying. So we build stories. We romanticize struggle, we glorify pain, we wear our wounds like medals and expect the world to accommodate them. But here's the twist. Pain doesn't make you special. How you respond to it does. This is where Nietzsche steps in. Nietzsche believed the highest form of human strength was not obedience, but self-overcoming, not victimhood, but becoming who you are, through fire, not comfort. He wrote of the Übermensch, the overman, not someone who dominates others, but someone who transcends themselves, who chooses their values, who creates meaning rather than waiting for it. To think like a leader, you must become that kind of person. But modern life seduces you into staying small. It rewards passivity. Our culture is addicted to external validation, likes, followers, applause. The currency of the victim is sympathy. The currency of the leader is sovereignty. One feeds your ego. The other demands your soul. You have to choose. And that choice is hardwired into your biology. Let's go even further. Your brain is built for survival, not greatness. The amygdala, your fear center, is constantly scanning for threats. It doesn't care about dreams, goals, or vision. It cares about avoiding pain. So when you consider taking responsibility, risking rejection, or stepping into unknown territory, your brain interprets it as a threat. It whispers, "Stay small, stay safe, stay silent." And unless you override that voice, unless you make a conscious, forceful decision to think differently, you'll live your entire life reacting instead of creating. That's how society keeps people in line, not through tyranny, but through distraction, through fear dressed up as caution, through comfort masquerading as peace. Aldous Huxley warned us in Brave New World, the future wouldn't be a boot stamping on a human face. It would be a world where people are so amused, so entertained, so medicated, that they no longer want to rebel. The danger isn't oppression, it's apathy. It's scrolling for hours while your soul rots in a corner you no longer visit. Machiavelli understood this too. In the Discourses, he makes it clear free societies don't last unless the people are vigilant, unless they hunger for power, not over others, but over themselves. But what does modern culture teach you? Don't rock the boat. Don't question authority. Fit in. Be nice. As if niceness ever changed the world. As if conformity ever led to greatness. So here's the quiet war happening beneath your everyday life. You are being conditioned to wait for permission. But leaders don't wait. They decide. They act. They choose meaning over comfort. They look fear in the eye and say, "You don't own me." And yet most people remain stuck. Not because they don't want change, but because they've mistaken victimhood for virtue. Because they've swallowed the lie that power is dangerous, instead of sacred. So the question sharpens, what happens when an entire generation mistakes survival for strength? What kind of world does that create? And more importantly, what kind of person does that make you? You don't feel a virus when it enters your bloodstream. You only feel the fever, the fatigue, the symptoms. Victim thinking is the same way. It doesn't announce itself with a grand entrance. It doesn't tell you, "Hey, I'm here to sabotage your entire life." It creeps in quietly, subtly. It speaks in your own voice. It wears your face in the mirror. And by the time you notice it, it's already rewritten the rules of your life. This is how it works. It doesn't say, "Don't dream." It says, "Be realistic." It doesn't say, "Give up." It says, "Now's not the right time." It doesn't say, "You're weak." It says, "You're just being careful." But behind those words is a brutal truth. You're being taught to shrink yourself. Not by dictators, not by tyrants, but by the tiny daily compromises you make in the name of normal. This is how people become prisoners without chains. Let's look closer. When you live from a victim mindset, you start unconsciously giving up three things: agency, ambition, and accountability. And the worst part, you start to feel good about it. You call it humility. You call it realism. You might even call it healing, but often it's just learned helplessness with a spiritual filter. The world claps when you're soft. The world claps when you stay wounded. Because as long as you're focused on coping, you're not focused on conquering. But beneath the applause is decay. Let's break this down in psychological terms. One of the most dangerous cognitive biases is external locus of control, the belief that your life is determined by forces outside of your power. People with this mindset tend to blame circumstances, other people, or luck for everything that happens to them. The result? When things go wrong, it's not my fault. When things go right, I just got lucky. There's no growth, no learning, no evolution, just an endless loop of reaction. Now combine that with confirmation bias, your brain's tendency to seek out evidence that supports your existing beliefs. If you believe the world is unfair, you'll only see injustice. If you believe you're powerless, you'll unconsciously sabotage every opportunity that proves otherwise. You'll avoid risk. You'll procrastinate. You'll stay stuck, because success would shatter the identity you've built around struggle. Now, throw in neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on repetition. Every time you respond to difficulty with victim thinking, you're strengthening that neural pathway. You're teaching your brain, "This is who I am." And over time, that becomes the default. So even when the chains are gone, the mind stays in the cage. This is why people who leave toxic relationships often find themselves in another one. Why people who escape poverty often self-sabotage their success. Because unless you change the identity underneath the story, you'll keep recreating the same prison with different wallpaper. And society, it rewards this, because a population that thinks like victims is easier to manage. People who blame, complain, and wait don't build revolutions. They don't lead movements. They don't think critically. They consume. They obey. They scroll. As long as you believe someone else holds the power, you'll never ask where yours went. This is Machiavelli's genius. He didn't write for people who wanted to be liked. He wrote for those who wanted to be free. In The Prince, he makes a startling claim: "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." Most people misinterpret this. They think it's a license for cruelty. But Machiavelli wasn't endorsing tyranny. He was saying something deeper. If you must choose between being respected and being liked, choose respect. Because being liked is temporary. It depends on others. But being respected, that starts with how you carry yourself when no one's watching. And you can't earn respect by begging the world to go easy on you. You earn it by choosing power when it would be easier to stay passive. That's what modern culture has forgotten. We obsess over self-care, but we abandon self-command. We talk about boundaries, but we forget discipline. We want softness without strength, healing without hardship, power without responsibility. And the result? A generation that's emotionally literate, but strategically bankrupt. People who can name every feeling they have, but can't take control of their own direction. People who say, "I'm enough," while quietly loathing their own mediocrity. That tension creates a kind of spiritual sickness. You feel it when you scroll past people doing what you wish you had the courage to attempt. You feel it when you lay in bed, knowing deep down you were meant for more. You feel it when you lash out at success, because it reminds you of the choices you never made. And here's the dark twist. The longer you stay in that place, the more comfortable it becomes. You start to enjoy your victimhood. You decorate it. You call it your identity. You bond with others over your shared sense of powerlessness. You build a home inside your own limitation. And like any home, you become afraid to leave it. But here's the silent cost. Your dreams, rotting in a basement called someday. Your potential, starving behind a wall labeled not yet. Your legacy, eroding while you rehearse a script that was never yours to begin with. So here's the breakthrough no one wants to say out loud. You are responsible for everything you tolerate, not just the things you choose, but the things you let continue, the stories you replay, the fears you obey, the identities you never question. That is the true cost of victim thinking. Not pain, not sadness, not even failure. The cost is who you never became. And if that thought stings, good. That's the wound we need to keep open. Not to punish you, but to wake you up, because you can't lead while you're still trying to be rescued. And you can't be rescued from a prison you secretly believe keeps you safe. So what now? We burn it. We break the pattern. We rebel against the voice that says, "Be careful," because the real danger is not rebellion. It's obedience to fear. And that's where we go next. Not just how to escape the trap, but how to turn and face it. How to become what you were always afraid to be: free. Every prison has a weak point, a crack in the wall, a guard who falls asleep, a blind spot in the system. But the prison you're in, the psychological cage built from fear, conformity, and silent self-betrayal, can't be escaped by picking a lock or digging a tunnel. Because the door's been open the entire time, you just never believed you had the right to walk through it. That's the first rebellion: belief. Not in some vague inspirational sense, but belief as a weapon. Belief as a war against everything that's tried to shrink you. Because if your mind has been colonized, your first act of revolution is reclaiming your thoughts. Start here. Stop asking for permission to be powerful. That voice in your head, the one that says, "Wait," or "Who do you think you are?" That's not your wisdom. That's your programming. It's the voice of every authority figure who wanted you compliant. Every system that preferred you passive. Every culture that profits off your doubt. So silence it. Replace it. Burn it. You don't need approval. You need conviction. This is where Machiavelli's genius becomes practical. He understood that power isn't just taken, it's assumed, claimed, worn like a second skin before the world is even ready to accept it. In The Prince, he wrote, "It is not titles that honor men, but men that honor titles." Translation: stop waiting to be crowned. Start behaving like the ruler of your life. Power doesn't come after success, it comes before. It's what causes success. But how do you step into that kind of mindset, one that thinks like a leader, not a victim? You start by doing the opposite of what the crowd does. Where the average person waits for motivation, you build discipline. Where others seek validation, you master solitude. Where they consume, you create. Where they react, you strategize. And where they obey fear, you stare it down like a wild animal and say, "You may follow me, but you do not lead." Let's make this real. When you want to blame others, stop, ask, "What did I allow?" When you want to wait for the right time, act, declare, "Now is the right time, because I say so." When you feel overwhelmed, simplify, cut what's non-essential, create clarity through decision, not delay. When you feel like quitting, zoom out. Ask yourself, will I regret this cowardice more than I'll regret the pain of pushing through? Every time you do this, you're rewiring your identity. You're creating a new default, one where you are not the passenger, but the driver. But rebellion isn't just a mindset shift, it's a system change. And to sustain it, you need to build what I call a code of leadership, not rules imposed from the outside, but principles you choose, define, and defend. Here's a basic one to start. I do not complain. If something feels wrong, I take action, or I let it go, nothing in between. I do not compare. The only metric I measure against is my past self. I take total responsibility, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. I speak with clarity. I say what I mean. I mean what I say. No games, no masks. I value results over feelings. Emotions are data, not dictators. I own my time. I protect it like treasure. I spend it like capital. I do not waste it to make others comfortable. I choose meaning over mood. I do what must be done, not just what I feel like doing. This code isn't about perfection, it's about orientation. It points your inner compass toward the mindset of sovereignty. But you need more than a code. You need a cause. Because leaders don't just rebel for themselves. They rebel on behalf of something greater. A vision, a mission, a reason to rise. This is the difference between selfish ambition and transformative leadership. One feeds the ego. The other births a movement. And your cause doesn't need to be grand. It doesn't need to involve nations or revolutions. It can be as quiet as breaking your family's generational cycle of silence. As humble as building a business that restores dignity to your name. As personal as becoming the person your younger self needed. But once you have that cause, everything changes. Fear becomes irrelevant. Doubt becomes a background noise. Comfort becomes an enemy. Because now you're fighting for something. And when you fight for something, you don't need to be fearless. You just need to be committed. Remember, courage is not the absence of fear. It's the refusal to be ruled by it. Which brings us to one last rebellion, perhaps the most radical of all. Forgiveness, not of others, of yourself. Because to lead, you must let go of the weight you've been dragging. All the times you stayed silent. All the years you obeyed fear. All the chances you let rot in the name of caution. It's time to bury them. Not as a way to forget, but as a ritual of transformation. You are not your past cowardice. You are not your former identity. You are the version of yourself that chooses to rise today. And that choice, that quiet, defiant decision, that is leadership. So here you are. No more illusions. No more waiting. No more bargaining with your own power. You've seen the trap. You've traced its roots. You've felt its cost. And now you've begun to break it. But before we close, one last thing remains, the final realization, the truth beneath all truths. Not about how to think like a leader, but about how to become one at the deepest level of consciousness. That's where we go next. And once you see it, you'll never unsee it again. At the edge of every great transformation, there is silence. Not the silence of peace. The silence before a storm. The silence that comes right before you do something irreversible. You stand at the threshold of a new way of being. One step forward, and the person you've been, the overthinker, the doubter, the victim, is gone. Not because they were evil, but because they were tired. Done, unfit for where you're headed. So here's the final truth, sharp, cold, and blinding like a blade of light. You were never trapped. You were never weak. You were never broken. You were just misidentified. You mistook your conditioning for your character. You confused your coping mechanisms with your core identity. You believed your fear meant stop, when it actually meant go. What you thought was a wall was a mirror. And the enemy, the one you were waiting to defeat, he was in your reflection, wearing your voice, smiling through your self-doubt. This is the brutal beauty of awakening. It doesn't make you feel good. It makes you feel responsible. Because now you can't unknow the truth. You can't keep blaming them. You can't keep numbing yourself with distractions. You can't keep dressing up fear in the costume of logic. Because now you know every outcome in your life, good or bad, was negotiated by the version of you who showed up. And the version that shows up next, that's entirely up to you. Let's cut deeper. You've heard the phrase, mindset is everything. But that's only half the truth. Mindset isn't everything. But that's only half the truth. Mindset isn't everything. Identity is. Because your actions will always bow to the person you believe yourself to be. You can force change for a little while. You can trick yourself with motivation. You can fake confidence. But in the long run, identity always wins. So ask yourself, who do I believe I am? If you secretly believe you're weak, you'll sabotage your strength. If you believe you're a follower, you'll fear your own voice. If you believe you're a victim, you'll resist every opportunity to lead, because leadership will feel like betrayal of the story you've told yourself for years. This is why change feels like death. Because it is. It's the death of the false self. And here's where most people run back. Back to safety. Back to noise. Back to the same drama, the same people, the same habits that keep them small. Because transformation is lonely. It costs relationships. It costs comfort. But most of all, it costs who you used to be. That's the final price. And if you're not willing to pay it, nothing will change. Not your finances, not your relationships, not your sense of purpose. You'll just keep dressing your wounds in new clothes and calling it growth. So what's the solution? Kill the false king. The inner tyrant who speaks in fear. The one who convinced you to bow, to wait, to soften. You don't need him anymore. You never did. Then, you crown the real one. Not a perfect version of you. Not a polished, smiling, social media version. But the one that's sovereign. The one that remembers. The one that's been waiting in the shadows, watching, grieving, preparing. He doesn't beg. He doesn't perform. He simply decides. This is the essence of Machiavellian leadership. Not manipulation. Not deceit. But vision, without apology. It's the ability to see what needs to be done, and do it. To walk into chaos and remain composed. To make hard calls without flinching. To stand alone and still know you're right. Because leadership is lonely. But victimhood is crowded. And you must choose who you'd rather walk with. The masses who settle, or the few who rise. Let's make this more real. From now on, your life must become a demonstration, not a performance. A demonstration. You don't argue with the world anymore. You don't plead to be seen, understood, or validated. You walk into every room like you were born to be there. You build. You move. You speak with intention. You use your time like currency. You filter your energy like it's sacred. Because it is. And when you fall as you will, you don't spiral. You don't sulk. You regroup. You adjust. You return stronger. That is how leaders think. Not with hope. With strategy. Not with blame. With ownership. Not with excuses. With results. And when someone asks how you became this version of yourself, how you went from passive to precise, from tired to terrifying, you won't say a word. You'll just look them in the eye. Because they'll already know. They'll see it in how you stand, in how you speak, in how you no longer flinch. This final truth is not something you recite. It's something you become. And that's the most Machiavellian idea of all. Power doesn't exist until you claim it. And once you do, no one can take it from you. So, here you are, at the border of who you've been and who you're about to be. Will you go back to the comfort of your old story? Or will you step into the wild, volatile, magnificent discomfort of true freedom? Because the door has been open all along, and the only question left is, will you walk through it?